The wind howled low across the dry hills, dragging sand and secrets across the cracked earth. The sun hung heavy over the broken fence posts of the Langley place, what was left of it. Clara Langley, barely 24, had known struggle since her hands could carry a pail. With her father gone 2 winters ago and her mother taken by fever, the ranch had become a ghost of what it once was. The roof leaked, the well coughed more dust than water, and all she had left were a blind mule named Toby and a shed full of broken tools. But Clara didn't complain. Not out loud, not when her hands still worked and the stars still came out each night. That morning, she'd gone to check on the last of her chickens when Toby started braying like the devil had tugged his tail. She grabbed the old shotgun, unloaded but it gave her courage, and ran toward the barn. Inside, the smell of blood hit her like a slap. Something moved behind the hay bales. "Who's there?" she called, gripping the wood tight. Silence. Then a groan. She crept forward, heart pounding, breath shallow. And that's when she saw him. A man, bare-chested, half covered in dust and blood, a deep gash across his side, and a revolver belt tossed beside him like it no longer mattered. He wasn't old, maybe 30. His face, despite the pain, was striking, dark hair matted to his forehead, beard just starting to grow. But it was the eyes that stopped her, half-lidded, fevered, but sharp beneath the haze, like they'd seen war, and worse. "Please," he whispered, "water." Clara didn't move. Her instincts screamed to run. A stranger, a bleeding man, no explanation. But something in his voice cut through the fear. She dropped the shotgun. "Wait here," she said, rushing to the kitchen, as if he could go anywhere. She brought back a tin cup and the last of her boiled water. He drank like it was the first kindness he'd known in weeks. She knelt beside him. "Who did this to you?" His lips parted, a breath. But instead of an answer, he collapsed into her arms. Clara worked through the afternoon cleaning the wound, whispering to herself for strength as she stitched torn skin with trembling fingers. She'd seen her mother do it enough times. By nightfall, he was resting in the loft, wrapped in her father's old coat. The fever had started. She sat beside him, brushing the sweat from his brow. He hadn't told her his name, but somehow she already felt like she knew him. The next morning brought silence. Clara stirred awake on the hay beside the stranger, aching from a night of half-sleep and worry. The fever hadn't broken. His skin was still hot to the touch, and his jaw clenched now and then as if chasing ghosts in dreams. She changed the cloth on his forehead, dipped in the last of her cold well water. "You better not die on me," she murmured, trying to sound firm. "I didn't waste my only clean thread just to bury you." Still no name, no story, no hint of where he came from or why he was lying half dead in her barn. She had questions, too many, but right now she needed him to live. Clara spent the rest of the day tending the few things she could. She fixed the chicken coop again, though there were only 3 hens left. She checked the fence and chased off a coyote that had taken interest in her mule. And she boiled herbs, the same way her mama used to, whispering prayers she didn't fully believe anymore. By sunset, she returned to the barn with broth and hope, and found him awake. Barely, but awake. His eyes followed her. They weren't fever-dulled now. They were sharp, alive. "Where am I?" he rasped. "Langley Ranch," she said, kneeling beside him. "Or what's left of it." He coughed, winced, tried to sit up and failed. She pressed a hand to his chest. "Don't be stupid. That wound will tear again." "You saved me. Seemed like the neighborly thing to do," she muttered. He looked around, confused, cautious. "How long have I been here?" 3 days. He blinked. Then, after a long silence, he asked, "What's your name?" "Clara." "Thank you, Clara." He said it like he meant it. She sat back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "You gonna tell me yours now?" Another pause. His gaze dropped to the floorboards. "Daniel?" Clara didn't believe him. Not entirely. It wasn't the name that felt wrong. It was how he said it, like someone who'd had too many names in too many places. But she nodded. "Well, Daniel, I've got broth and no reason to waste it." He took the cup from her with a trembling hand and sipped slow. When he finished, he whispered, "You live out here alone?" Clara hesitated, then answered truthfully, "Yeah, been that way a while now." She expected pity or doubt, but instead he just nodded, respectful. "You're tougher than most men I've met." She tried to hide the smile that tugged at her lips. But something in her chest shifted. This stranger with haunted eyes and secrets in his voice, he wasn't just another drifter. Clara could feel it in her bones. He carried weight, not just in the blood soaking his shirt, but in the silence between his words. And though she didn't know it yet, Daniel wasn't the only one who'd been saved in that barn. By the 3rd evening, Daniel could stand, barely. Clara found him leaning against the barn post, the sunset casting gold across his face and shadow down the length of his bandaged side. He looked out at the hills like he was expecting someone to appear from them, or maybe trying to forget who already had. "You shouldn't be up yet," Clara called from the porch. Daniel turned slowly like he hadn't heard her approach, but the tired smile he gave was real. "Didn't mean to worry you," he said. Clara stepped down from the porch, wiping her hands on her skirt. You didn't. But if you tear that wound open again, I ain't patching you twice. He smirked. Noted. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging gently at her braid and the collar of his shirt. You expecting someone? She asked finally. Daniel's gaze lingered on the horizon. Not anymore. It wasn't much of an answer, but Clara had grown used to the way he talked. Like every word cost him something. She crossed her arms. You're not like most men that come through here. No? Most men would have stolen the mule, the food, and the boots off my porch before I had a chance to blink. He looked at her then, brow furrowed. Someone done that to you? Clara shrugged. Not yet, but that doesn't mean I sleep easy. Daniel looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't. Instead, he asked, Why didn't you run when you found me bleeding in your barn? Clara looked him straight in the eye. Because you weren't pointing a gun at me. Daniel nodded slowly, as if filing that away. They walked together back to the porch, step by step, like two people trying to learn each other's rhythm. Clara helped him sit on the bench, brought him more broth, and let the silence settle again. But just before the stars came out, Daniel spoke. I used to own land, a lot of it. Clara raised an eyebrow. Around here? He hesitated. Farther east. Farther from anything, but it didn't feel like mine. She didn't press. Something about the way he looked at the stars told her he'd lost more than just land. He turned to her then, a flicker of something deeper in his voice. You think it's possible to start over, Clara, out here? She nodded slowly. I think the land don't care who you were, only what you plant. Daniel leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered, That might be the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me. And Clara, sitting beside a man whose name she still didn't believe, felt something shift in the dust between them. Clara woke the next morning to the sound of boots on soil, not hers. She stepped out, still lacing her work apron, and found Daniel by the corral with Toby the mule, or rather, trying to persuade him to move. He doesn't like anyone, she said, amused. Took me 3 years to get him to follow me without kicking. Daniel gave her a crooked grin. Figures. He's the only one around here more stubborn than you. She rolled her eyes but couldn't help the smirk that came with it. Daniel was healing fast, faster than made sense for someone that hurt. But Clara didn't question it. She'd seen men give up over paper cuts and others walk through fire. She had a feeling Daniel was the second kind, and that meant the scars he carried weren't just under his shirt. They spent the day repairing fence posts, working in near silence. Clara handed him tools, watched him favor his side, and listened for the things he didn't say. Late in the afternoon, while she was drawing water from the well, she asked casually, So where'd a man like you learn to ride fences? He didn't look up. Military? Clara paused. Army? He nodded once. Something like that. That explained the way he watched the tree line when the wind picked up, the way he moved like he was never fully at ease, like he expected trouble to ride up any second. But Clara knew better than to dig when someone wasn't ready. The land had taught her that. Push too deep, and the ground swallows you. That evening, they sat on the porch again, sharing stale biscuits and the quiet. You ever think about leaving this place? Daniel asked. Clara looked out across the hills. All the time, she said softly. But it's not the land that's holding me. It's the promise I made to my folks when they passed. Keep it standing as long as I can. Daniel looked at her for a long time, as if weighing something. And if someone helped you? She turned to him. What do you mean? If you didn't have to carry it all alone. Clara's throat tightened. No one had ever offered that before, not without strings. She studied his face. There were no strings in his eyes, just a quiet kind of knowing. But just as she opened her mouth to answer, hoofbeats echoed in the distance. She stood. Daniel stood too, slower, sharper. 2 riders came over the ridge, dust trailing behind. Clara narrowed her eyes. She didn't recognize the horses, or the way they came straight toward the house like they'd been there before. Daniel's jaw tightened. His fingers flexed near where a holster might have once rested. You know them? Clara asked. I might, Daniel said softly. But they're not friends. The riders came in slow, deliberate. Not a word, not a wave, just the steady rhythm of hooves against dry earth and 2 faces too clean for frontier dust. Clara stepped down from the porch, squinting under the brim of her hat. Daniel moved beside her, standing straight now despite the pain she knew still ran through his ribs. His jaw was clenched like stone. The taller of the 2 riders wore a coat too fine for these parts and eyes that didn't blink enough. Afternoon, he called, pulling on the reins. Clara didn't answer. She waited. The man dismounted, dusted off his sleeves, and looked at Daniel with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. We've been looking for you. Daniel didn't flinch. Didn't leave a trail. You never do, the man replied, amused. But money makes a scent all its own. The second rider hadn't moved. He stayed in the saddle, hand resting just close enough to his side to make Clara nervous. She glanced at Daniel. You going to tell me what this is? She asked under her breath. Daniel didn't look at her. Not here, not yet. The man in the coat tipped his head. Is this the girl who stitched you up? Clara's fists tightened. Daniel stepped forward. Leave her out of this. The man smiled wider. Oh, Daniel, always trying to protect what ain't yours. Clara's voice cut through the tension. Who are you people? The man finally turned to her. His smile didn't fade. We're just associates. Daniel here forgot some obligations back east. Daniel didn't move. I walked away. You disappeared, the man corrected. With a ledger full of names and just enough information to make people nervous. So here we are, to remind you. The second rider shifted in his saddle, still silent, still watching Clara too closely for her liking. Daniel's voice dropped, cold, controlled. You're not getting what you came for. The man's grin faltered for the first time. That so? That's so. The man gave a slow nod, then looked at Clara again. Did he tell you who he really is? Where he comes from? What he owns? Clara blinked. The man didn't wait for a reply. You're sitting on more money than most towns see in a lifetime, and he's hiding it right here, playing cowboy, bleeding in your hay. Daniel took a step forward. Say one more word. The man held up his hands. Fine, just delivering a message. He turned back to his horse, mounted smoothly. Before leaving, he looked down at Clara one last time. He's not what he seems. Men like him never are. And they rode off, the sound of hooves fading into dust. Clara stared at Daniel long after they were gone. Is it true? He didn't answer right away. But then quietly he said, Yes. All of it? No. She crossed her arms. Then tell me, now! Daniel looked at her like a man standing at a crossroads with no good direction. And finally he said the words that would change everything. I'm not just Daniel. I'm Daniel Calder, heir to Calder Rail and Calder Holdings. And I walked away from it all, until they followed. Clara swallowed hard. Why? His eyes softened. Because money never meant much to me, but this place? You? That's the first thing in a long time that feels real. Clara didn't speak. The wind did. It blew across the field, rattling the fence wire and kicking dust into the stillness between them. Daniel Calder. She turned the name over in her head. It sounded like the kind of name printed in newspapers, carved into train depots and banks. The kind of name people whispered when they didn't think the rich could hear, and it had been lying in her barn, bleeding, silent. So everything you said, all those quiet half-truths. Clara's voice wasn't angry. Not yet. But it was steady. Daniel stepped forward. I wasn't hiding from you, Clara. I was hiding from everything I used to be. She crossed her arms. You could have told me. Would you have believed me? She paused. Maybe not, but it would have been honest. Daniel looked at the dirt, jaw tight. Back east, I couldn't breathe. Surrounded by people who smiled and sharpened knives in the same gesture. I tried to walk away. I sold what I could, gave away more. But when I didn't play their game anymore, I became a threat. And now you've brought it here, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel winced, not from pain in his side. This pain was deeper, guiltier. They won't stop, she continued. Men like that don't ride this far just to talk. Daniel nodded. I know. She studied him. For a long moment, the only sound was Toby munching hay like the world hadn't just shifted. Finally, Clara exhaled and sat down on the porch step. So what now? Daniel followed, slowly, wincing with each movement. I leave, he said. I ride out tonight, draw them away. You won't see me again. Clara turned to him, surprised by the ache in her chest at those words. You really think that solves it? He looked at her. I think it protects you. She shook her head. Daniel, I've been protecting this place with nothing but my 2 hands and borrowed luck. You think I'm scared of a couple men with polished boots? He blinked. Then what are you saying? She stood again. I'm saying this ranch has been one wrong day from collapsing for years, but I didn't let it. Not when my folks died, not when the well dried, and not now. She stared into his eyes. If you run, they'll follow you, and they'll come back here anyway when they realize what you care about. Daniel swallowed hard. So we fight, she said, together. A smile cracked the edge of his face, genuine and full of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. You sure? Clara smirked. You're not the only one who knows how to dig in. And just like that, 2 people from different worlds, one poor, one powerful, both broken in ways they didn't show, made a quiet decision that would change both their fates. Not to run, not to hide, to stand. That night, Clara lit the lantern in the kitchen and spread out the only map she owned, yellowed, torn at the edges, and missing half the river lines. But it was something. Daniel stood across the table, still pale, but alert. The bruises on his ribs had turned dark and ugly, yet he moved like a man who'd been through worse. If they come back, they'll do it before the week's out, he said, tracing a line along the ridge with his fingertip. They'll camp up here, where they can see the valley. Wait till you're alone. Clara leaned in. Then I won't be alone. Daniel looked up, surprised. She straightened. There are women in these hills who owe me a favor. Some I've stitched up. Others I've fed when they were running from worse than debt. They'll come if I ask. Daniel studied her. An army of women. Clara's smile didn't waver. Don't underestimate what a woman can do with a pitchfork, a skillet, or the right reason to fight. That night, Clara rode out under the stars. Toby grumbled, but carried her sure-footed through the hills and gullies. She knocked on 3 doors before sunrise. One opened to Sadie Whitmore, a widow with a hunting rifle and a sharp tongue. Another to May Carter, who'd lost a child and never forgave the men responsible. And the third to Louisa Holloway, a former saloon girl turned trapper, with eyes colder than creek ice. They didn't ask questions, just listened, nodded, and saddled up. By the time Clara returned, the sun was rising, and 4 women stood in her yard like ghosts pulled from dust and silence. Daniel watched from the porch, eyes wide. Clara dismounted. Told you. He stepped forward, tipping his hat. Ladies, Sadie grinned. So this is the billionaire with a target on his back. Daniel blinked. She told you? Clara shrugged. They needed to know who we're risking our hides for, May added. Besides, folks like you don't bleed in barns unless there's a hell of a story behind it. Daniel chuckled, despite himself. That's fair. They spent the day setting traps near the fence line, reinforcing the barn doors, and stashing rifles and firewood where they could. The ranch began to look less like a crumbling memory and more like a fort no one would take easily. That night, around the fire, Daniel passed around coffee boiled thick and bitter. They sat in silence, stars overhead, the sound of coyotes howling from the ridgeline. Clara leaned close to him and whispered, You still think you need to run? Daniel looked at the women, faces lined by grief and grit, women no one would have trusted with a fight until they were already winning it. Then he looked at her. Not anymore, because something had changed in him. For the first time in his life, someone wasn't protecting his money. They were protecting him. The dawn came quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that carried weight. The sky burned orange at the edges, and Clara stood on the porch with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the ridge. The others were scattered across the ranch, each woman in place, hidden where the land offered its sparse cover. Daniel joined her, buttoning the coat Clara had stitched back together 2 nights ago. The limp in his step was still there, but the fear, it was gone. They'll come today, he said. Men like that don't bluff twice. Clara nodded. Then they picked the wrong ranch. They didn't speak again for a while. The land didn't like chatter before battle. Just before midday, the dust rose. 3 riders first, then 2 more behind them. A black wagon followed, too clean, too polished for country roads. Clara's fingers gripped the wood railing of the porch. They brought more this time. Daniel exhaled slowly. Doesn't matter. From the trees, Sadie signaled with the reflection off her rifle scope. Louisa was already moving, unseen through the dry grass. May waited inside the barn, guarding the back with 2 barrels and nothing left to lose. The lead horse stepped forward. Same man as before, the one in the fine coat, but this time his smile was tighter. Miss Langley, he called, tipping his hat. Nice day for a conversation. Clara didn't step down. I reckon we passed a conversation last visit. The man chuckled. Then let's be quick. We came for Daniel. He leaves with us, or the land gets burned to the ground. Daniel stepped up beside her. You think money still scares people out here? The man's grin returned. Money? No, fire, yes. He raised a hand. One of the men behind him lit a torch. But before the flame could catch, a shot cracked through the air. The torch dropped. The man yelped and clutched his hand, bleeding. Clara didn't flinch. Daniel smiled. Sadie's voice called from the trees. Next one's between the eyes. Chaos erupted. The men reached for their guns, but Louisa was faster. A warning shot whizzed past the second rider's ear. May opened the barn doors with a boom, standing tall with a rifle that looked older than her but just as dangerous. The invaders paused. Outnumbered, outsmarted, and worst of all, outwilled. The man in the fine coat cursed under his breath. This ain't over. Daniel stepped down from the porch, pain be damned. Yes, it is. You tell your partners back east that Daniel Calder isn't alone anymore. You want to fight, bring lawyers, or better yet, don't. The man held his bleeding comrade and spat into the dust. But he turned, rode off. The others followed. No fire, no gunfire, just dust and bruised egos. When the ranch was quiet again, the women stepped out from hiding. Clara walked down the steps and looked at Daniel. He was pale, breathing heavy, but standing. Still think you should have left? He looked at her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the world. No, I think I finally found home. Clara smiled. Good, because we've got fence to rebuild. They both laughed, and the sound of it echoed across the land like a promise. The wind that afternoon smelled like ash, but nothing had burned. It was just the memory of fire, drifting in on dry heat and old scars. Clara stood at the edge of the corral, watching Daniel feed Toby with one arm and clutch his side with the other. The adrenaline of the standoff had faded, but the questions remained. She turned to him, arms folded. So, what now? Daniel looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. Now? I fix what I broke. Start by wiring some of my accounts. Legally transfer what's mine, so no one can try this again. Clara raised a brow. You're going to use the money you ran from? He nodded. I ran from what it meant, not what it could do. He walked toward her, slower than usual, but more sure-footed. I can fix the well, replace the fencing, maybe even bring in real hands to help rebuild the barn. But this place, the heart of it, that was always you. Clara looked away, cheeks pink with sun and something else. I didn't save you for your money. I know, he said gently. That's why it means something. The next few days were filled with movement. Daniel wired funds from a discreet contact in Denver who still owed him loyalty. Materials started arriving from the rail station: wood, nails, new rope, and tools Clara had only seen in catalogs. But not all of it came by freight. Women rode in, more of them. Word had spread. Not about money, not about Daniel Calder, but about Clara Langley, the girl who stood her ground with nothing but stubborn grit and built a wall of women around a broken ranch. By the end of the week, 11 women had taken up quarters in the old storage shed and barn loft. Some were widows, others were just done being forgotten. They worked like men and laughed like thunder. Clara watched it all with a mix of awe and caution. She wasn't used to help, especially not help that didn't come with expectations. Late one evening, she sat with Daniel under the stars, drinking strong coffee and resting her bare feet on a porch rail that had finally been nailed back into place. Feels like things are changing, she murmured. Daniel nodded. They are. Do you ever miss who you used to be? He thought for a long moment. Only when I think of who I could have become if I hadn't run. Clara looked at him, eyes soft. You didn't run, Daniel. You wandered, and sometimes it takes getting lost to realize what kind of man you want to be. Daniel smiled, slow and quiet. And what about you? She sipped her coffee. I was never lost, just waiting. They sat in silence a while longer, and when their fingers brushed on the rail between them, neither pulled away. Because some roots grow deep in dry land, and sometimes what saves you comes on horseback, bleeding in your barn, and changes everything. A month passed. The Langley Ranch no longer looked like a place time had forgotten. The fence stood proud. The barn doors swung straight. The roof no longer leaked when it rained. And for the first time in years, Clara hoped it would rain, just so she could watch the drops slide off something that finally held. The women stayed. Not all of them, but enough. Some came and went with the seasons. Others carved names into the beams of the bunkhouse Daniel had paid to rebuild, like signing a page of history no one else had written for them. It wasn't a sanctuary, it was a start. Daniel had stayed too. Though he still got letters postmarked from cities he no longer cared to answer, his boots stayed dusty and his eyes clearer than they'd ever been in marble buildings and velvet rooms. He worked alongside the others, hammer in hand, sweat on his brow. Clara didn't ask for it, but she didn't stop him either, because it meant something to see a man choose effort over escape. One morning, Clara stood at the edge of the property with Daniel, staring at the old archway above the main gate. The wood had splintered, the lettering long since faded. Langley Ranch, it had once read. She held a new sign in her hands, carved by May, painted by Louisa, and hung with Sadie's old nails. Daniel looked at her. You sure? Clara nodded. It's still my name, but it's not just mine anymore. Together they raised the new sign, Langley & Co. Underneath, carved in smaller letters, founded in grit, built by women, defended with heart. Daniel stood back, wiping his hands on his jeans. You know, there's probably a man in New York right now cursing my name over some missed fortune. Clara smiled. Let him curse. He didn't get what mattered. And what's that? He asked, even though he knew. She didn't say it. She just reached for his hand. And in that sun-warmed silence, fingers intertwined with dust and calluses, they stood as something more than survivors. They were home, not just on the land, but in each other.